ever an epoch, including with our founding fathers, where they weren't struggling. I think you get things together for a while in politics, then you lose it. People have a hard time holding on to a set of principles, even as I think important as our Constitution, our founding documents. The changes occur, people drift. So I view politics as a constant process that's always going to be frustrating. And the part about politics that intrigues me is continuing to fight, continuing to adhere to principles and to try to communicate those principles and fight for what I view as limited government and the freedoms that we've been given by our Constitution. That's what I want to preserve and help pass on to the next generations. And if we can achieve some of that, at least make people aware of what they're losing by following the intolerant left, which would destroy the Constitution, Hillary Clinton included. I think we are winning because we are continuing to fight.
Well, I think back when I was sort of helping out with my grandfather, who would always talk about what occurred and how life was at the turn of the 19th century. I mean, he was much older than I was, obviously. He was an old man when he had children, and relatively old when he had children. So he talked about 1905, 1910. My father was born in 1909, the year of the Stanley steamer. But and they talk about those times and how things have progressed, and not really for the better. But here I am. I talk about the 1940s. I'm still young. I'm only 73 years old. And I talk about the 1940s and 1950s and how we've progressed from there. And it doesn't seem like we are a more free nation today than we were back in the 1940s and 50s. And certainly not as free in the 40s and 50s as we were back at the turn of the century. So if you draw a trend line, it looks like we're not going in the right direction. We may have some of these minor victories, but they are overshadowed by the overwhelming tsunami of regulation by a corrupt government. And I mean they're all corrupt in my mind right now, except for a handful of officials that get very little say whatsoever. What say you on that?
The theme of my book, Partners in Crime, is how the Clintons have devised a scheme to monetize the White House with a foundation that's really a criminal enterprise designed to enrich them, which is violation of the fundamental sin you can commit with a foundation is inurement, and that means to use the foundation as a means not to do charitable work, but to solicit funds based on, the misery of others, earthquakes, disasters, etc., and then to steal the money out of the foundation, which is exactly what I say the Clintons have done. And I can prove it through the fraudulent financial reports that they've filed. Now, if you look at the Clintons, I think we're at a low point in terms of the fundamental appreciation of the freedoms we've been given and of limited government, because the Clintons have each they've amassed $100 million in net worth each. And, you don't get paid $100 million the Secretary of State. You don't get paid $100 million to be a senator. And they've had no other jobs but the Clinton Foundation, and that's where they've made their money. And, the theft of the foundation, the diversion of funds has been classic. I spent a lot of time working with banks, and I was the one who really caught the HSBC money laundering scheme. I first published that, to break the case when I had a banker come out of HSBC, and he brought 1,000 pages with him of how these pass-through accounts were being created to launder money. The Clintons have pass-through accounts. WJC LLC, Bill Clinton's initials, William J. Jefferson Clinton, is a pass-through account. It's just a separate bank account, a corporation that does nothing except launder money. You don't know where the money coming into it came from or where it's going. And this is classic money laundering techniques. So in a sense, I agree with you. I think we've allowed our politics to come to the point where we too are headed down the path of Argentina. and we've got to, stop the debt, stop the social welfare programs. They're out of control, and get politicians who understand that their job is to work for the people, not enrich themselves.
I would be somewhat disappointed if, in fact, only 50 or 75 of our elected officials, congressmen and senators, were complaining and really vocal about this and on TV every day. I would be disappointed if 50 or 75 only. We hear nothing from anyone. None of those clowns are ever on TV, and when they are, they couch their words in such a manner that it almost makes it almost apologetic. And what really hacked me off is when there was a town hall for the Libertarian candidates, Gary Johnson and his vice president. And they asked what their thoughts were of Hillary Clinton. And they said, well, she's a very competent or something like that, or very qualified, public servant. Who's kidding who? I mean, you don't have to be a mobster to identify a mobster. You can tell by her very actions that what she does is that she is scamming the system, and skimming on everybody else. Am I just overly critical because I come from the streets of Harlem and I was born and bred that way? Or please square me away before I think I lose it all.
Well, I think the vast majority of Americans would agree with you if they took the trouble to look beyond the surface. And one of the things I think, for instance, let's take the Clinton Foundation in terms of how it operates. If you just read their annual reports or look at the internet, the Clintons are telling you all the good work they're doing. They're showing you, here's Bill Clinton in Africa, and here's Bill Clinton in an earthquake in India or in Haiti. But then when you look at the financial statements, the audited financial statements, and try to track the money, you realize that less than 10% of what has been given to the Clintons in many instances has been spent on the charitable purpose. Yeah. You find, they're living in 5-star hotels, they're flying around in private jets. Bill Clinton's making millions of dollars, $48 million in speaking fees while his wife was Secretary of State, but they don't show up in the Clinton Foundation financials. There's no line item speaking expenses. They're not given to the foundation. Maybe they're run through the pass-through account. Maybe they, are paid directly to the Clintons. But the Clintons, are using this facade of charitable work to hold these glitzy Clinton Global Initiative meetings every year in New York. They portray themselves as having solved AIDS or helped to solve AIDS in Africa, when the truth is, they've been ripping money off of the UN. In no year does the UN agree, the figures from the UN agree, the amount of money the UN says they gave the Clintons, so the amount of money the Clintons got. And then the Clintons went off to India and bought effective HIV/AIDS drugs from a company called Ranbaxy. And those drugs would have done no one any good. For years, they delivered those drugs to Africa. Then you say, okay, well, what's their delivery system in Africa? Well, Clintons don't really have a way to get these drugs to the people suffering in Africa. They're running the entire health initiative out of a little office in the warehouse district of Boston. I went to it. There's no sign on the outside of the building. You can't find out how many people work there because the financials don't give you any detail. I finally ended up asking, the only guy I could find was the guy who delivered soda to the office, and he told me there were about 25 people working up there. But this again is, how do they deliver drugs to AIDS victims in Africa with no staff in Africa, with no distribution system in Africa, with no ground game in Africa? These are the problems. And they're buying the discount drugs. And you say, well, are they using the money to buy the drugs? Well, it looks like, the UN is buying the drugs and giving the Clintons this money. Clintons are setting up the arrangements, and the financials are not clear how much of the money they're getting is actually going to purchasing the HIV/AIDS drugs. And this is the biggest program the Clinton Foundation does. It's a complete scam.
Well, there's something like 32 big scandals that they've been involved in, and maybe that's not a perfectly accurate number, but it's pretty close. And how come with all of the checks and balances, I remember from school we had checks and balances in our government, and now we have the Department of Justice, another corrupt organization. But yet they've never been nailed for any of this. They've never been prosecuted. And even when Hillary talks about her emails, which is obvious where she lied, still nothing happens. There's so many checks and balances in our system, and none of them work. I have lost all faith in our government.
The Constitution was predicated on honorable, God-fearing people. These were Christian, believing, and people who fled to the United States, many of them for religious freedom, and they were dedicated to ethical living and ethical principles of living. Now, if a government gets run by corruption, where the money, the Clintons amassed this huge amount of money, ripping it off of a foundation, no one does anything. Well, the Department of Justice then begins to operate as a political institution under the Democrats. It doesn't, it's one-sided. Dinesh D'Souza does a movie, and $10,000 he gives in a bundled payment where he, violated the FEC laws, and he gets thrown the book at him. They wanted to imprison him for years.
Yeah, he got 8 months in jail, didn't he? He was on my program just a couple of weeks ago.
Well, he had to go to an overnight facility for months and sleep there every night, and then he's still, I think he's got 3 or 4 or 5 years where he's teaching Spanish to teaching English to non-English speaking immigrants. Well, this is, yet Hillary, violates all of the first of all, the foundation violates all the fundamental, both at the state and federal level. Nobody even investigates the foundation. And then you listen to, Comey, and by the way, Comey was on the board of HSBC when Loretta Lynch was the U.S. attorney in New York, who gave HSBC a hand slap, $1.9 billion fine. Well, that sounds like a lot of money, but nobody went to prison, and they were laundering, who knows how many billions of dollars they were laundering. So Comey comes from this culture of corruption, and then they say, well, the Clintons, just skate by because they have all the power, all the money. They no one dares to bring a criminal case against the Clintons. Even Comey said, no prosecutor would bring a case against the people this famous. Well, the laws weren't written to protect famous or rich people. It was supposed to be equal justice at law for all people.
Right.
And once you abandon that principle, once you begin running the government like a mafia, where the IRS denies conservatives 501c tax deferred or tax favored treatment, but yet, the Clintons or any other leftist cause gets retroactive letters, is not required to do determination letters, operates the foundation any way they want to operate it, submits financials that are patently ridiculous, don't have no details in them whatsoever, don't reconcile anything to what was actually given to the foundation, don't show you how the money was spent. This is really egregious, the management of the foundation. And yet no one does anything. Well, over time, this culture of corruption, which we have in our government and have allowed to get into our government, becomes the dominant culture. And the other politicians, even the Republicans, Paul Ryan, McConnell, these Republicans get in there and stay for decades, become rich as politicians living in Washington. Our founding fathers never envisioned that someone was going to make a career out of politics or become rich as a result of being in politics. They expected it was a public service you did for a while. The ancient Roman standard of Cincinnatus, who comes and helps fight when he's called upon and then goes back to his farm, not expecting to get rich on it. That's the culture the civic culture from which, our republic was founded. But once you start losing it, it's very hard to get it back. And I think the American people are finally seeing. I think this is why Donald Trump is beginning to do well. The American people are realizing that both Democrats and Republicans, the leadership in Washington, is corrupt and basically in agreement with one another. Tea Party voters go out and they think in 2010 and 2014 they're putting in conservatives into Congress. They get to Congress, then immediately, having run on we're going to repeal Obamacare, the leadership in the GOP says, oh no, we can't repeal Obamacare. And the voters feel absolutely cheated. So you've got an anger, I think, in the American electorate that the elite doesn't recognize, because even the elite media is corrupt, not reporting the truth, reporting in a partisan way. You've got to wake up some point and say, we're living in in early stages of Argentina. And as it gets more and more into debt, as we get less and less able to function as a viable economic entity, we're going to get more and more corruption. And there'll be less and less people can do about it.
People know that Argentina, 100 years ago, even surpassed the United States in entrepreneurship, in free enterprise, in the standard of living. And then when the socialist government took over and decided to redistribute the wealth, it went downhill. And I have friends who have relatives that still live in Argentina, and they've been through 2 devaluations within the past 20 years of their currency, 4-1, I think it was, and impoverished the entire state even further. And it seems like Brazil used to be called the nation of the future. And they said forever Brazil would be the nature of the future because its socialist tendencies will always hold it back from prospering. And now it seems that the United States is Brazil. Is that a good characterization?
What the Clintons show, and Obama's accelerating the pace. Obama had $10 trillion in debt that he's going to accumulate it, doubling the national debt. Right. Now, that's not sustainable. There's no way we can go with the next president to 20 trillion rather, end up with a $40 trillion debt. At some point or other, the country becomes insolvent. You can't pay the interest on that debt. And, the country gets to have then the quality of junk bonds because the credit rating of the United States, which has been downgraded in the Obama administration. And people don't recognize that we've suffered a downgrade, from the rating agencies, which is, absolutely unimaginable going back into the 40s or 30s, even in the Depression era. The country was always attempted to run on a solvent basis without accumulating this kind of debt. But the socialism, now our schools, our media, New York Times, even the Wall Street Journal is a shadow of what it was 20 years ago. It's watered down. The American public is not keeping up with current affairs. They're not watching the news. They're not learning history. They're being taught in schools, even in colleges, a politically correct approach to life, which is not going to benefit them when it comes to earning a living. It's not going to be a skill that they can really productively apply. And we're getting, under Obama, 90 million people who aren't working. Well, this is the end. Socialism tends to tell everybody about it's going to be utopia. And then in the end, it produces 90 million useless people that right. The socialist regime has no idea what to do with except to kill in some kind of a war or epidemic or whatever, put them all in a gulag, because the socialist view does not value human beings. It doesn't look at these as 90 million productive human beings, which could be motivated to learn and to put their talents to good use. And people would do it if they were given the right opportunity in the right direction.
Right, I agree.
But I think it starts really with a fundamental disregard of the values that we, if you go back and you read the Federalist Papers, or our founding fathers were worried that as the system became successful, as the republic they were putting in place succeeded through hard times, through wars, through fighting, that it would lose the edge because it would become too comfortable, become too easy. And now we've got the left preaching equality. Well, all the arguments that's, disinformation that comes out of the left, they're in terms of racial, all the social justice. Well, instead of crediting the United States with ending slavery, they blame the United States for having had slavery. Well, again, it's the wrong understanding of what we've gone through historically. The Democratic Party wants to argue it's, the party of racial justice. Well, in 1948, the Dixiecrats walked out of the Democratic National Convention, led by Strom Thurmond, because they were segregationists. They didn't want Harry Truman introducing, bills that would have established more racial justice. The Democrats were the party in the Civil War of slavery, the party that dominated the South. This is the theme of Dinesh D'Souza's current movie, Hillary's America. And he's right. But we don't teach this in the schools. And the African Americans, are blindly just going and voting for Democrats. And then what's Obama done for the African Americans? He's done nothing for Detroit. The unemployment rates, the lack of income, the drug rates, the crime rates in the African American community have all deteriorated under Obama. And yet, the Democratic Party expects in the 2016 presidential election to get 96% of the Democrats, of the African Americans voting for Democrats. Donald Trump, I think, is going to make an inroad there. But the point is, in a socialist regime, there is no truth spoken because the truth is dire. So you have to have then disinformation and propaganda. Then political correctness and intolerance, because you don't want anybody to be allowed in First Amendment to point this out. It becomes godless. The state is in charge. The state's going to produce a utopia. Well, no state on the face of the earth has ever produced utopia. And a utopia without God is not going to work. Human beings need to have, religious freedom. They need to have religious values. We're facing tremendous challenges. If the Clintons are allowed to get this foundation through, you've got a corruption where I've got an article running of the 5 convicted foreign criminals that the Clintons worked with as top donors, that they, celebrated at the Clinton Global Initiative annual meeting. Criminals. And there's another dozen of them that are near criminals, because that's what the Clintons attracted. It was every grifter in the world knew that all you had to do was pay them and you got access to power. Well, that's corruption. And we shouldn't be allowing it to happen. That's, I think, one of the major themes I've been trying to fight in my writing career, and it's not popular. I mean, I'm still going to be boycotted from Fox. I'm still not going to get on with my book. I haven't been asked a single interview, even on Fox, not a single interview on TV with my book, the Partners in Crime, because the mainstream media, even Fox today, doesn't want to point out fundamentally the corruption of the Clintons.
Right.
Because
at that point, you'd be exposing the entire system as a corrupt system. You'd have to involve it all. You can't really segregate just one and say it's sort of like the police in a neighborhood noticing that someone's robbing a store and doing nothing about it. Do you blame the robber or do you blame the police for that crime taking place? Well, you have a tendency, the robber's the bad guy, but the police is allowing it to take place knowingly, does nothing about it. So now you have to blame the police, and no one wants to blame the police in that hypothetical scenario. We have the same situation here. We just heard that the $6.5 million was erroneously neglected from being booked military expense. $6.5 trillion was erroneously eliminated or forgotten about and not booked, in debt. Well, where's the action on that? The 6.5 trillion, I don't know about you, but it seems like a lot of money to me. Doesn't that make now our national debt closer to $25 trillion? And how come we hear nothing about it in the mainstream media?
The fundamental issue of government spending, this is the problem. You allow bureaucrats who are not really accountable. They weren't voted. They're appointed, they have jobs, and they're spending public money, which is not their own money. And they're careless with it. It's wasted or lost, or the program doesn't work. There's no loss to the bureaucrat. They still have their salary. And look at the tremendous expansion of Washington under Obama. Now it started going back to World War II, but Washington is today one of the highest cost cities in America. Because of the influx of the government employment and the bureaucracy. That bureaucracy spilled over into Virginia. Virginia used to be a conservative state. Virginia now has got all these bureaucrats. The bureaucrats are leftists because they believe that government action, government involvement is going to solve problems. The government's incapable of running anything. Our founding fathers knew that. It's incapable of spending the public treasury responsibly. It is not feeling any pain in raising taxes and spending it like drunken. Our government makes drunken sailors look good. Right. And it's never happened to this magnitude in the history of the world that you have a wealthy nation that essentially the Democratic Party is just stealing from in the process of bankrupting it.
The position that you take, how did you ever get invited to be on MSNBC? I can see Fox being upset with you because you're talking about the system itself, and they defend the system overall, but they're partisan. But MSNBC, you're hitting them right between the eyes. What kind of conversation? I don't watch MSNBC, so I hadn't seen you on there. So I was wondering what transpired during that particular interview.
I used to be I haven't been on TV really in a couple of years. It's been really since about 2011. What I'm trying to explain to people and tell people and point out in books like Partners in Crime, the corruption is not just the Clinton administration corruption. It's the corruption in the IRS that they will not demand the Clintons produce honest and legitimate audited financial statements. It's again the corruption in the financial industry. It was the same kind of corruption you saw in Enron that brought down Arthur Andersen. Now you've got major firms, including PricewaterhouseCoopers, who are doing the auditing for the Clintons, and it's still irresponsible. You still can't make heads or tails out of the financial statements. And when you do, you find diversion of money, reorganization. The Clinton Foundation reorganizes, $17 million gets missing from the financial statements when, the health initiative was part of the Clinton Foundation, and then when it was a separate corporation. And, even after it's a separate corporation, the accountants still consolidate all the auditing and the reporting together as if it were one entity. This is completely irresponsible. And same with the Department of Labor and Department of Justice, which is not investigating, won't investigate the Clinton Foundation. I'm asking people in my book to take the complaints into state attorney generals, because the state can shut down the foundation nationally and internationally to conduct an investigation in that state, because the state laws on inurement are being violated. And any person who's given $1 to the Clinton Foundation has a claim at law saying, I was defrauded of that dollar. And that should be sufficient to have a court case or a state attorney general investigate. But it's going to take great courage to do it, because in a corrupt system, you don't want somebody like me pointing out the corruption. You don't want a book, because the corruption is both sides. The Clinton Foundation has existed with both Republicans and Democrats in power. George W. Bush did nothing about the Clinton Foundation except participate in it, raise money with Bill Clinton in Haiti. The public reports on Haiti after the earthquake said in many cases fewer than a few pennies on the dollar ever got to Haiti. Went to beltway firms, went to consultants, got diverted. The Clintons built luxury hotels, which do not help the people suffering from the earthquake. I mean, these were travesties of how $1 billion was put into Haiti, and there's nothing to show for it of any particular improvement of the life of the average person. And yet the system doesn't report it, or to the extent it reports it, it's ignored. The public officials in office, Department of Justice, IRS, don't take action. And so your example, your analogy of the police watching the store being looted, pretty soon looting the store is commonplace, and no policeman is going to dare arrest a thief or a looter, because they'll be blamed. The policemen will lose their jobs. They will be the ones who are admonished because they dared to enforce the law. Look at our immigration laws. The Democratic Party is berating Donald Trump because Donald Trump wants to enforce the laws. The Democratic Party is announcing it has no intention of enforcing any of our immigration laws. Obama had executive orders that were designed to circumvent the laws. Well, I mean, how do you run a country when at the very top, the president is trying to circumvent the laws? And it's considered to be honorable that he's doing so. If we want unlimited immigration in the country, fine. Congress should pass a law to that effect. We should have a rescinding all the laws that limit immigration or that call people who get here illegally that they violated our laws. We should quit enforcing the border. And that's what the globalists want. The globalists who are advancing socialism don't really believe in socialism. They believe in concentration of power in the global corporate elite, the transnational global elite. And, the original formation of this formula was essentially National Socialism. National Socialism, Nazis were socialists. Hitler wanted concentration of power between the government and the big corporations. He had a welfare state, take care of everybody who was not going to be able to be useful. And he instituted universal health care. That's the same basic formula. If Hitler had what we have today in our government, plus the National Security Agency that could spy on everyone, and the CIA that can operate illegally, doing whatever it wants to do with secret budgets, Hitler would have been delighted. Basically, Merkel is happy to be, the EU is essentially, what Hitler was trying to establish, United Europe under Germany's control, with the transnational corporations in charge. In Hitler's day, it was Wall Street and, Brown Brothers Harriman and the Bush family, Prescott Bush, who were doing the interlocking directorates, running a Nazi bank in the United States, U.S. Bank. We're doing interlocking directorates between companies like IG Farben and the U.S. counterparts, U.S. Steel, etc. I mean, we were managing, essentially, we were funding Hitler out of Wall Street in the 30s. And that formula, that National Socialist formula, is essentially what we replaced the Constitution with. And people, assume the transnational corporations should be in control, should set the rules. And we've assumed that a welfare state we can't live without. This is all nonsense.
Well, the government. Excellent job of dumbing down the American people. It seems that when I get to speak to people or people calling on the program, one problem we have is the ability to think rationally. We just take sound bites, regurgitate them, and repeat them. And it's difficult to have an intelligent conversation when people are just picking sound bites and repeating them because they don't make any sense. In addition to that, I was sort of delighted that Donald Trump took the nomination, the Republican Party. However, after listening to him and several of his speeches, his solutions on the surface sound like they're going to solve problems, but his execution is horrible. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make economic sense. It's anti-constitutional, half the stuff he wants to do. And he's not really solving the problem, like when he says he's going to eliminate Obamacare and replace Obamacare, with another form, Well, he doesn't come back to the Constitution and say, we're going to have a free market healthcare system where you can go back to your doctor and not fill out 45 forms before you see him that you've already filled out the week before, and he doesn't have to hire 5 or 6 people on his staff just to keep government off their back. He doesn't address any of that. He just seems to change it, and some of the changes, in my opinion, make things even worse.
You've got to give Donald Trump credit for, I do. I've known Donald Trump a long time, and I think he's going to, if he is president, he's going to get top advice. Going to say, okay, Heritage Foundation, how do we replace Obamacare? There's plenty of good thinking on replacing Obamacare with free market solutions.
But he doesn't say that, sir. Doctor, he didn't say that. He says he's going to replace it. Well, why doesn't he say we're going to go to a free market system? He says he's going to eliminate Obamacare and replace it with another system. No, we don't need a system. We need the free market. He doesn't talk free market. That's what upsets me about him, or concerns me about him, I should say.
Rode with Romney for 3 weeks at the end of the campaign. Every one of his speeches was classic free market. He didn't mean any of it. He wasn't going to close down, the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, or its current, counterpart, Health and Human Services. But you go to Washington, close down half of it, close down 2/3 of it. I'd fire by department. I don't care which department I'd start with first.
Right.
But the point is, Romney talked free market, but he wasn't free market. The GOP leadership is not free market. Now, what Trump is doing is he's at least articulating issues that have to be articulated in terms of, getting back to employing people, ending globalism. I mean, if Trump laid out fully all solutions that he might contemplate, same as go back and read Reagan. Reagan gave great radio addresses before he was governor. But when Reagan ran for office, he rarely ran articulating the details of his free market programs. Those came in later, because again, you're dealing with an electorate that's not going to accept it, and it's not going to be everything Donald Trump does. The media picks apart and tries to create a news cycle. Romney spoke out against Benghazi right after it happened and said, this was a travesty. Well, instead of the media focusing on Hillary and the fact that our ambassador and 3 other brave Americans died, the media jumped on Romney, saying he was speaking out without being informed. So you've got a news cycle problem in running for office. I think Donald Trump, it may not be perfect, may be flawed in many ways, but he is certainly, I think, is touching on a populist theme. I said from the very beginning, Donald Trump will much of the time look like he's losing. He always does, but he doesn't lose. And I think the polls are turning now, right at Labor Day. You're going to see the polls. We already have seen polls where Donald Trump is pulling ahead. After Labor Day and after the debates, I think Trump is going to open up distance. I think Hillary is going to increase. Hillary's off theme. Hillary's going to have to defend the foundation. She's going to have to defend her emails. New emails are coming out all the time. If Julian Assange has new emails he's going to drop, those are going to hurt. And she's off message because she doesn't want to be talking about her emails. She wants to be, talking about what she wants to do as president. But Hillary's got so many conflicts. I mean, And these, I think, now systematically, the new team that's been put together with Trump is going to exploit. Hillary says, Donald Trump dishonored a Gold Star father when he talked out about the Muslim father who lost his son fighting in the Middle East. Well, Hillary dishonored all the parents of Ambassador Stevens and the 3 other Americans who had died when their bodies were flown back to the United States. She's talking about some movie as the cause of the terrorism. She refuses to call it terrorism, even though she that night wrote an email to Chelsea and said it was a terrorist act that was going on in Benghazi. I mean, so the contradictions in who Hillary is,
Right, I agree.
are going to, I think, ultimately be surfaced and defeat her.
What about Gary Johnson? Would he not be a viable choice in this case, where he's a true free market person? He has experience in government, so he's a realist. He knows his limitations. He knows what he can get done, what is impossible to get done, and what can be changed immediately to benefit everyone. It may not sound good, but it will work a lot better.
I think despite many of the themes that he's talking about, which are good themes, and much of what he says I'd agree with. I'm not a Republican or a Democrat. I've always been Constitution Party, Howard Phillips. Third parties have a very, very difficult time in America. We just don't have a tradition of third parties. In Europe, it's different. In Italy, I don't know how many parties there are because there's so many. France has multiple parties, multiple party systems. They go along with a prime minister system and a cabinet system where the party that holds the majority in parliament gets to pick the prime minister. And the president is often more of a figurehead. That's the fundamentally different system. Our system has gravitated after the very first elections. Because if you remember, even the way the Constitution was originally written, the president and vice president didn't have to come from the same party. It was 1 and 2, basically, who were president and vice president. So that system went by the way very quickly because the two-party system became ingrained in America. And I think it's from the very early days, by the 1800s, we were headed towards a firm two-party system. And the way our presidential elections are held dictate it, because you can't really have 15 parties. It's not going to satisfy constantly somebody's elected president who had 15 or 20% of the vote. That's just not going to cut it. American people expect, a majority, certainly an electoral college, but even when we have a popular vote where the majority differs from the electoral college vote, as we did in 2000, it causes consternation in the political system. Basically, we are a two-party system. So I don't think, despite the message being good in the Libertarian Party, I think a lot of the people who are going to be voting for Trump are really libertarians, are not conservatives. And I don't think the political party, Democrat and Republican, are going to mean anything in their current configuration over the next decade. Because you've got the leadership of the GOP in Washington, this Democratic light. Paul Ryan and McConnell would pass the Trans-Pacific Partnership in a heartbeat, whereas the vast majority of Republican voters, the conservatives, don't want it, and the vast majority of the Democrats don't want it. The working Democrats don't want the TPP. But the problem is, our parties, we're at a crux where we're undergoing a fundamental shift in the electorate. Every few years, every 20, 40 years, the American electorate goes through a realignment. It happened in Nixon, when the South, which had been solidly Democratic and largely segregationist, began to move to becoming more conservative. And Kevin Phillips, in a great book, Emerging Republican Majority, which is a tough book to read unless you're mathematically inclined or understand electoral statistics. But Kevin Phillips correctly predicted that Nixon could do what he had as a Southern strategy. And he tied together Southern states that were increasingly conservative, no longer segregationists to the extent they had been in the 40s and 50s under the Democrats, had embraced, the civil rights legislation, and we're moving in that direction. But yet we're fundamentally Christian conservative. Right. At that time, under Nixon, we had basically what in a European sense would have been a Democratic Christian Party, which was the core of the Republican base. Today, the core of the Democratic base in the European sense would be considered a socialist party. Correct. And the core of the Republican Party is no longer Democratic Christian. It's, moderate socialist. It's a hybrid at the leadership. And that's the problem, is that I can see, just like Reagan did, that there's going to be a realignment. I expect that you're going to find as many as 20 to 30% of the African Americans are going to vote for Trump, and in excess of 30% of the Latinos, Hispanics, maybe as many as 40% are going to vote for Trump. And the Trump turnout is going to be massively stronger than the weak turnout that Hillary's going to get. I don't know anybody who's enthusiastic about Hillary. The clothes she's wearing are hideous, like bags. She's old. She's obviously coughing. There's something I've been writing extensively about her health problems.
Yes, she has health problems.
And she suffered this massive concussion, which knocked her out, Bill Clinton said, for 6 months. Well, as a result of a concussion of that magnitude, there's almost certainly going to be mental impairment. And, she suffered this sinus thrombosis behind her ear of a blood clot. It's very rare to get a blood clot back there. That's not typically where the people, and it's a very serious problem to get a blood clot back there. And these are issues which have not been adequately explained to the American people. And she's, having difficulty even climbing into her SUV without a footstool. She's having difficulty standing and giving a speech without being propped up. She's getting confused, losing her way, doing bizarre behavior that look like epileptic, or at least petite seizures, right. That come and go. And all this stuff is getting, ignored. Well, it's not going to get ignored through the entire rest of the campaign, because she's going to fall down, she's going to trip, she's going to stumble, she's going to forget, going to give incoherent answers, going to start giving incoherent speeches. She could suffer a major health crisis and have to be taken off to a hospital. This is the next 2 months are when the American elections, presidential elections, don't really start until after Labor Day. Nobody's paying. Everybody's at the beach. Everybody's having barbecues. Well, in September, kids go back to school. People pay attention more than they have all summer, and they're going to start looking at Hillary, and she's going to look like an old, worn-out candidate without a message. Her only message is, I want power and I want money.
Well, Trump being a free market capitalist guy, I am surprised he has not embraced the libertarian message, of free markets, of government non-intervention, of freedom to choose, reduction of government regulations, more of that, rather than talking about he's going to increase the number of border securities and build a wall and build about military. He sounds like a neocon on steroids. Now, I appreciate the fact that our border should be secure, but we also shouldn't be bombing the hell out of everybody around the world who wants to come back here and kill us, which is probably the reason why we need to have secure borders, or a good reason for it. But he does not address the core of the problem. What causes the problem? He wants to keep everything the same, but try to solve how we address the problem once we create it. And it drives me nuts. I don't know why he doesn't do that. And in that vein, why don't we get a Gary Johnson? What he has to say is more free market, more constitutional. He should be out front, in my opinion. And I'm not saying this from a party point of view. I'm just saying from a logical point of view.
I'm telling you, Romney, who articulated much more of these values, libertarian values, than Trump didn't mean it. He had no intention of doing it.
I know he didn't. He had Romney cares. And then he talked against the Obamacare type thing, and that was talk with forked tongue. That was a classic case of forked tongue speaking, and no one believed them after that. I didn't, not for New York Minute, and so I want to see someone who's practiced what they preached. And at least in Gary Johnson's case, he has some history in that. And why hasn't Trump taken a lesson from that? I mean, if he wanted to know how to get attract the hearts and minds of the people, he'd be talking about free markets and not more government programs.
Trump doesn't talk about those themes as much as he could, but he's lived them. I trust that Trump has a much better understanding of the private economy and individual freedoms.
I agree.
Yeah. And now, the Libertarian Party, and whether it's Gary Johnson or someone else, is going to articulate these values. But what I'm telling you is that it's intellectually satisfying to have Gary Johnson out there. It's not politically practical to think he's going to gain any traction because it doesn't work. This is the argument. I knew Howard Phillips, pretty well towards the end of his life, and Howard, we'd have lunch in Washington. He talked to me about how he tried to argue with Reagan that Reagan needed to form his own party. And if you remember, the Republican Party fought Reagan tooth and nail, just like they're fighting Trump.
That's correct, right?
Right down to the end. Okay, and Reagan's answer to Howard Phillips was that he understood that the Republican Party was not a conservative party, but he also understood that he wasn't going to win unless he had the backing of the Republican Party, because in a two-party system, you've got to come from one of the two major parties. Now, that Trump doesn't reflect the Republican Party any more than Ronald Reagan reflected the Republican Party. They hate Trump. In the same way, Washington establishment hated Reagan and did everything they could to undermine him. I mean, Reagan, now I've heard the stories. I was never in the Reagan administration, but I've heard the stories from people who are. For instance, in the speech of tear down the wall to Gorbachev, Reagan wrote that into the speech maybe over and over again, and his speechwriters took it out. Even some of his top advisors, I questioned how truly conservative they were. And Reagan found himself, one of the huge problems when you're president is you get to Washington. I mean, I go back to, my father was close to, had worked with, the labor union, he worked with the Democrats, and knew Jack Kennedy, knew Lyndon Johnson. One of the great frustrations when you're president, you come in to the Oval Office and you issue an executive order and you realize how little gets done, or you give a directive to a department. The department says, Mr. President, that's not in our rules and regulations. We're not going to do that. And so until you can get a consensus in the American people, a perception that, as our founding fathers had, that big government is fundamentally corrupt by nature. It has to be corrupt. It's inevitable. It's like you're saying big government corruption. It repeats itself. It's not necessary to say both. Big government is inherently corrupt. That's the problem. And when you look at what it's going to take to solve that, it's not going to happen until people wake up. Now, what Trump is trying to do is trying to get people to understand that instead of 90 million people sitting at home, watching Netflix, not knowing what to do with their lives, that they could be doing something creatively. They could be, and yes, eliminating a lot of the rules and regulations would be required there. But if the people start saying, hey, was the founding fathers' motivation, the original idea of the republic, I could do something, I could contribute, I could make some money, I could make something out of my life. When that thought gets in there, well then, people like you, people like me at our age, aren't going to sit home and watch television. We're on the radio, we're writing books, we're out there trying to make a difference because we believe we can make a difference. And we believe it's incumbent upon us to make a difference. Well, if Donald Trump can reinstill that ethic in people, where they begin to understand that, they can get involved. And what I see in the rallies, and I do take seriously the number of people that are showing up for Trump, is that there's like there was with Reagan, there's a new spirit coming in.
Right, I agree.
And people call it populism. They call it all kinds of names. But essentially, what the American people are saying, we're sick of, we got rid of Boehner, now let's get rid of Ryan. Then we'll get rid of McConnell. Then we'll get rid of anybody who's been in office.
Get rid of everyone.
Eliminate departments. I used to do a lot of consulting for, banks and insurance companies. And I can remember telling a insurance company executive, he asked me what he should do to help the company. I said, fire by floor. And I said, I don't care which floor you start with, but I wouldn't necessarily exclude the top. He said, I don't think it makes any difference which floor you fire. Just fire a whole floor of people.
Okay.
Don't change your culture overnight. When I ran for dealers, I used to tell the compliance officer, we'd have 1,000 registered reps. I'd say, I want to see 25 terminated. So, well, how do you know this? I said, I know there's probably 1,000, half of them are probably criminal. Go catch 25.
Dr. Corsi, we're just about out of time. I'd like to give you the last 1 minute to maybe tell us what we have to look forward to and to summarize and close things out for us, please.
I'd like people to take a look at my Partners in Crime, because I think the book is about not only the corruption of the Clinton administration, but the corruption that we've allowed to come into our system. Big government is inherently corrupt, and it's going to allow, what are we going to have? Obama's going to create a foundation, and he's going to go rip people off for $1 billion. And what are we going to have? The Putin Foundation, and every two-bit tin dictator in the world is going to have a foundation and figure out a way to rip off people selling influence, inurement, ignoring the laws. We cannot allow this kind of corruption to continue, and we can't take it casually that it is happening, and it's going to take dramatic steps, and these steps are in line with principles I'm sure most libertarians would agree with. I'm not precisely a libertarian. I'm more of a constitutionalist. I'm more of a my thinking is more Republican oriented than it is libertarian. But at the same time, I think we've got to restore individual liberty. We've got to get people to, I can make a difference. That, I'm not going to live on welfare. If I have to go get a small farm and do something. Well, today the EPA is on your neck if you want to get a small farm. And you got a dozen regulations. Well, we've got to get rid of these and let people get back to it. I think if we don't, you're going to have, if Hillary wins, I think you're going to see a secession movement take effect in America. So I think people have had it. They've had it. They don't want any more United Nations. They don't want any more, trans-Pacific partnerships. They don't want any more NAFTAs. They don't want any more global government. They don't want the EU. They're sick of it because a group of bureaucrats in Luxembourg is not my idea of a way to run a country. And I think we're going through a sea change, and I've continued to write and continue to stimulate people to think about, the alternative, which starts with we're not going to take this corruption any longer. And the Clintons are a good place to start because they got all the corruption we need, and it's ample, it's easy to see, it's obvious, it's a clear target. And I think if Donald Trump, as he's starting to do, attacks it every day, the American people will rally.
Okay. Dr. Corsi, thank you so much for being on our program. I hope you will accept our invitation to return at a later date. And folks, please, his book is Partners in Crime. Buy the book. Thank you very much, Dr. Corsi, for being on our program today. Folks, this is the end of today's program. We'd like to thank our sponsors for the financial support, and we'd like to thank you for listening in. You can further the cause of liberty by recommending this program to your friends, and let us hear from you. Our email address is comments@libertytalkradio.com. Remember, you're either allowing your liberties to be taken away or you're striving to protect them. Unfortunately, there is no middle ground. Until next time, this is Joe Cristiano. You've been listening to Liberty Talk Radio. Stay well, stay tuned.